What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing songs and they carrying signs, mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. When people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children. What's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner. Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. I'm really happy to have with me as my guest a personal friend of mine, Ellen Brown. How are you, Ellen?
I'm fine. How about you, Lauren?
I'm great. You're in Colombia. That's pretty cool. Visiting your
Right.
son, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're here to talk about your article about neoliberalism in Truthdig, but first I wanted to read your bio. So you are the founder of the Public Banking Institute and the author of a dozen books and hundreds of articles, and they're all on your Web of Debt blog. You developed your research skills as an attorney practicing civil litigation in Los Angeles. In the best-selling Web of Debt, which was originally published in 2007 and reissued in 2012. You turned those skills into an analysis of the Federal Reserve and the money trust, showing how this private cartel has usurped the power to create money from the people themselves and how we, the people, can get it back. In the Public Bank Solution, published in 2013, you trace the evolution of two banking models that have competed historically, public and private, and you explore contemporary public banking systems globally. You've presented these ideas at scores of conferences in the US and abroad. Now, we're here to talk about your article that you just published, Neoliberalism Has Met Its Match in China. Now, you start your article by talking about the Federal Reserve's recent interest rate cuts, saying that it goes against the Fed's own reasoning, given that the economy is growing and unemployment is low. Why did the Fed do this?
There were many different commentators had different theories. Some said that they caved to pressure from President Trump. But apparently the reason was that other central banks were lowering their interest rates, and that in order to remain competitive, the thought was that we would have to lower our interest rates, or otherwise the dollar would become too strong relative to other currencies because investors would rush with their money into, put it into US investments because the interest rate is better. President Trump said that he was going to impose heavy new tariffs starting September 1st on the Chinese. And the Chinese then responded by, they stopped supporting it. In other words, they stopped manipulating it and they let it fall. So it fell below this supposedly critical level of 7. And that freaked everybody out because that would mean that once again, the dollar would become stronger and the Chinese products would be cheaper. And so supposedly that would hurt our manufacturers. But the problem is, our manufacturers, we don't have anything really to sell, as Michael Hudson pointed out in a recent interview. So it's really futile. What you wind up with, obviously, what we've just triggered is a currency war. And we've seen these before. And what happens is it's a race to the bottom. Everybody gets hurt. Nobody wins. So it's not a good strategy.
Now, yes. Now, you say in addition to reducing interest rates, devaluing the currency won't help the U.S. economy, but it has helped the Chinese economy.
I think it was really just a tactic to, it's like, all right, if you're going to impose more tariffs on us, we will stop supporting our yuan. If you don't think our yuan is worth 7 or whatever, above 7, then we're just going to stop supporting it and let it go where the market lets it go. But then they raised it again the next day. So they pushed it up, or they did support it just a little above 7, so that, the market's eased for the time being. But you can see that their artillery is as heavy as ours. I heard one commentator, I heard Larry Kudlow, who's now President Trump's economic advisor, and he said, well, I think that tariffs are hurting them more than they're hurting us. And then I heard another commentator say, it's a strange system where the goal is to hurt the other party more than you hurt yourself from your own policies. What about, like, we all feel better? What about we help each other and, we all come out winners?
Yeah, that would be a strange thing for the U.S. to do, because we always have to have an enemy. We have to have a boogeyman. I did an earlier show. We talked about their Belt and Road Initiative, which is something we should be joining, not fighting. But you discuss how China uses its state-owned banks to subsidize its businesses. Why do they do that? And explain why it's not a problem if some of those businesses can't repay their loans.
Chinese government owns 80% of the banks. So they own most of the banks and they own most of the businesses. So what they are basically doing is issuing credit for the business to, they have their 5-year plans. So you've got your 5-year plan, you want to build whatever, high-speed rail, do all this industrialization, different things you want to do. So you have state-owned enterprises or even private enterprises. They support the businesses that will be doing whatever the plan was, and they support them with the below market loans, which is, a good thing. We should do that as well. It seems to me our businesses definitely need support. They need cheap credit, our local businesses, but that's what they do, support their businesses, and they support their wage earners. And so the wage earners can work for less because they don't have the education costs we have, they don't have the medical costs we have, and they don't have the transportation costs we have. Actually, the communist government supposedly took care of all that, and now they've gone half capitalist. So they've gotten rid of the part where it was clearly unworkable to have the government own everything. That obviously didn't work, and it collapsed in Soviet Russia. But it does work for, this is what I think Japan figured out, that all you have to do is control the commanding heights. Like, you don't have to control all the industries. You only have to control the credit mechanism. So if you're controlling where the money's coming from, you can put the money where it's needed for whatever your 5-year plan is. And they would have a problem of political unrest. They have a massive population, and of course years ago they've had political unrest. So in order to avoid that, one of their policy goals is just to keep everyone happy by supporting their lifestyles, making sure that everybody can afford to go to school, can afford to catch the bus or whatever, can afford to get to work, and can afford medical care, that type of thing. Why is it that it's not a problem if they don't pay back the loans? The Federal Reserve recently confirmed that banks do not lend their deposits. They actually create deposits on their books when they make loans. So in other words, the bank creates the money that they lend. 97% of the money supply is created in this way, according to the Bank of England. So if you've got a bank, if you were actually lending somebody else's money, then you would clearly have to pay that person back. And if there was a default, there'd be a problem. But if you're creating the money on your books, you lend it out and it doesn't come back, then you can just carry it on your books or write it off or move it onto the books of the central bank, and nobody is hurt because the bank is the government. It's like in the ancient times when they used to do debt jubilees, where the government was the lender or the temple was the lender, and they would just forgive the debts, and nobody was hurt because there weren't any private lenders that had put up their money. In this case, no money is really put up. It's just credit advance that doesn't get paid back. So the only problem is you've got some money out there that wasn't there before. You've created some new money that wasn't there before. But that's actually a good thing, because there is not enough money in the economy. I mean, there's definitely not enough money in our local economy, as you can see, where everybody's in debt. I mean, how can it be that everybody's in debt? It's because of this peak debt problem, where the only way you can get out of debt is somebody has to borrow some more money. So the bank is getting richer and richer in this parasitic fashion of sucking this money out that wasn't there, that was never created. So somehow you have to get extra money in the system. And one way is debt forgiveness, or, something in the nature of a debt jubilee, which this would be, where you're just forgiving the debts of businesses that were doing their job and they were state-owned in the first place. And it's like, well, okay, it didn't quite make the books balance, but it doesn't matter. So anyway, it's good to get some extra money out there. Well, that's why we need a UBI, or universal basic income. That's why it would be good to make zero interest loans to states. I mean, there's so many things the central bank could do to get more money out there that would be productive. Right now, they do quantitative easing and the money goes to the banks.
And we all have to pay exorbitant interest rates on our debt, while during the quantitative easing, they were paying nothing. And it was trillions of dollars that we know that were given to them. It wasn't just the TARP money. So you say that this model of corporate lending in China is like a form of industrial policy, which we don't have here. You know, we eschew anything that even sounds like industrial policy because it sounds like communism with the 5-year plans. And yet they have industrial policy in Germany. They decide they're going to subsidize the solar industry, for instance, and now they don't need to subsidize it anymore because it's flourishing. Well, we can't have that in this country because we have big finance has taken up such a huge percent of our economy. Our economy is beholden to the big banks and the corporations, and their compensation is based on short-term profits. I mean, the whole system is so screwed up. They said the supply side economics give more tax breaks to the businesses, and they're going to hire people and invest in plants. They don't do that at all. They just buy back their own stock to pump up the stock price. So the short-term profits look better, and that's what their compensation is based on. I mean, it seems like with the influence of money in politics, right, in this country, with the bankers and the corporate CEOs giving so much money to these candidates, that we're never going to be able to change the system. You have an earlier article, The American Dream is Alive and Well in China. And you point out that in the US, only 65% of people own their homes. And in China, it's 90%, and 80% are owned outright. How is it that they're able to do that when, their wage is so much less than ours?
Well, that's the thing. They don't have the education costs, they don't have the transportation costs, and they don't have the medical costs. Well, they tend to save more than we do. But I mean, we can't save because we don't have
no interest. There's no interest.
Yeah, we've got to put the kids through college. So you've got to sock away like 100,000 or 200,000 per child for university, and housing is very expensive, et cetera. So they tend to buy a home like outright. So that cuts that cost of the house in half, because 50% of a cost of a house is financing on average, or they at least put like 50% down. Whereas we tend to, certainly in the subprime era, people were doing nothing down, which meant they were paying exorbitant sums in interest. So they never had any savings. Even rich people didn't have any savings because they were meeting, the payments on a bigger house. So the major factor is that the government supports the industries and therefore supports the workers. And so they can live on a lot less. And so their money could go into housing. They consider housing their wealth. Of course, we would too if we could afford houses.
I want to go back to something that you said about the Asian problem in 1997 and 98. And because I remember something was going on then, but I really wasn't paying attention, and economics has never been my strong suit. But you actually describe it as Western financial interests sabotaging the economies of Japan and South Korea. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, in the 70s and 80s, Japan was, you remember they were just taking off. Their economy was just booming, and they were the number one banker in the world. Like everybody owed Japan money. And the fear was that we would become Japan Inc., that they would be taking over the US. So it was like a Cold War. We had to bring down communism because they actually aggressively were trying to spread their model. But the Japanese had this reduced model, which was called state-guided capitalism. So it was the state controlled the money and owned the banks, and did their 5-year plan or whatever. So they controlled where the capital or where the credit went, but it worked really well. And so everybody else started copying them. The Koreans copied them, and they were called the Asian tigers. They all copied the system, and the Chinese copied it. What was destroying our economy was the free market system. And so the free marketers got in there and talked them into doing likewise, opening up their markets so that foreign investment could come in. George Soros was one, where they speculated against, like, the short sold the currency of these economies and brought the currency down, crashed the currency, forced them into huge debts. And so that's how they brought down. First it was Japan, and then the Asian tigers, including Korea. But China didn't fall for it. I mean, China was still a closed system. And so China was the last man standing. And so we've been trying to infiltrate there ever since. And of course, we've done it. China joined the World Trade Organization, so they had to comply with different rules. I remember reading a long time ago, something written like in 2002. It was a Chinese woman economist. And she said, well, if they want us to call them non-performing loans, we'll call them non-performing loans, but we're not going to change our ways.
Is that what you mean when you talk about how China protected itself from the similar sabotage that the U.S. did to Japan and South Korea?
Well, at the time, they just didn't let their currency float. That was the first thing. If you let your currency float, then the investors could come in, the speculators could come in and force it down, because it's floating. Float means that its value is determined relative to its exchange rate, what you can get for it on the market. Whereas the Chinese just they set the value of the yuan wherever they wanted to set it, and that was it. And also Malaysia did that, and Malaysia was the only one of those Southeast Asian countries that escaped.
It must kill the United States that we can't control China the way we have controlled so many of these other countries. I think about BRICS. Remember, we were all talking about Brazil, Russia, India, China, and how they were going to, have their own currency and go off the petrodollar. And little by little, the U.S. just sabotaged that whole plan. I mean, you're in South America right now. There are so few socialist countries left. I mean, what we've done to Brazil, for example, and now Bolsonaro is cutting down his own rainforest, which is going to be huge contributor to the climate crisis. I mean, it's huge. We're instrumental in that in terms of bringing down Dilma Rousseff and then putting Lula in jail, who's the most popular. I want to just digress a little bit because you're down there. What is the mood down there?
Yes, well, I'm only in Colombia, so I can only tell you what the Colombians are thinking. I said, what do you think of this new president who is more conservative even than the last president? He's obviously neoliberal. And they said, well, they can't say that much has changed, I think they're kind of used to corruption. And so they expect corrupt things to happen. The ordinary people, they just don't put much faith in their government because they know that, manipulative things are happening at the top. I mean, the people I see are fine. It's not like Venezuela where people really are being tortured.
Oh, yeah. Well,
but there are actually a lot of Venezuelan immigrants here who are on the streets begging. So
right. Well, we're just doing a horrible thing to that country. I mean, we've frozen their gold in London. We've frozen their money from Citco, which is their wholly owned subsidiary of their Venezuelan oil company, where we've got a trade embargo. We're not letting any other countries give them any food or medicine. I mean, it's outrageous.
Chavez was actually giving oil he was trying to do this Bolivarian revolution, where all the Latin American countries would share. And he was helping out these Latin American countries by giving them very cheap oil. And he was great. He offered to do that for us, and we wouldn't allow it.
Except in Boston, I remember he was giving in Joe Kennedy's district. They were giving free heating oil to the poor in Boston.
They were giving subsidies to Haiti, and there were riots recently in Haiti. Well, the reason was that they used to, these oil subsidies used to go to the poor. That was what they were supposed to be for. And when Maduro, got cut off from everything, or when we cut off those oil subsidies, then the poor are starving. I mean, it was a good thing that we have really cut off. And it was the revolution that they were trying to instigate was one for the people. Yeah.
Yes, it was. I've done several shows on Venezuela. I'll send them to you. So what do you think are going to be the results of these trade wars? I really don't think that the Chinese are going to buckle. I mean, his latest round was responded with, now they're not accepting any of our agricultural products. And this is really hurting the farmers. Now, personally, could be a good thing because I think we should grow and use all our food locally. I think global trade in agricultural products and many products really contributes to the climate crisis. And we really need to learn how to grow our own food and have more of a plant-based diet, which I've recently gone on. What do you think, are going to be the next steps here? I mean, how long are the Republicans going to allow Trump to do this? And where do you think this is going to end?
Well, my fear is that it will end in a real war. I mean, there are all these things going on in the Pacific, that all these war things being set up. So if we only had an economic crisis, I would almost see that as a good thing, because nothing's going to change until the people are really, until we really wake up and so, all right, okay, the Chinese are hurting more than we are, but we're hurting. And what's the point of a policy that's hurting American manufacturers, American agriculture, et cetera?
Right.
So that could like you said, and me too, I had no interest in economics like 30 years ago or whatever. I used to just turn on the news and for 10 minutes in the morning to see what the basic issues were, so I wouldn't sound like an idiot at dinner. And that was about it. And but now, we're all really interested. And why? Because we see that our livelihoods depend on it.
Yeah.
We need to understand, because we can't trust the people at the top to make good decisions. They're making bad decisions.
And we can't trust the media to tell us what's really going on either, because they have vested interests in propping up the corporate state. I mean, look at what's happening to Bernie Sanders. I mean, the whole second debate was a pylon. They basically asked every single moderate to attack Bernie Sanders. I screenshot like 9 of the questions, and I think it only backfired on them. Speaking of Bernie Sanders, you talk about quantitative easing, like Trump wants more quantitative easing. You think that it could be done, but it could be done differently. In your way, almost sounds like Bernie Sanders' program. So can you describe what quantitative easing should look like?
The quantitative easing that we've had, people think that they've been printing money like crazy and inflating the money supply, but there are actually 2 economies. We've got 2 economies going on here. One is what Michael Hudson calls the parasite, and the other is the host. The host is being starved of money, as I was explaining before about this whole problem with interest, et cetera. The parasite is getting bigger and fatter and fatter and fatter. So the way the quantitative easing worked was the banks they had all these bad loans on their books, and therefore we would either have to put them into bankruptcy or to declare defaults, et cetera. So they had these bad loans on their books. So the Fed bought the bad loans off the books of the banks and gave them reserves. The bank's deposits are in their reserve account. Our deposits are in a sort of fake bank account that doesn't really have real money in it. Theirs are the ones that have the real money in it. Real quantitative easing, the money would not go to the banks. It could go directly to the federal government, which would then use it for programs, whatever they've decided they want to do. But now they would have money that would not be, they would not have to pay it back. Until you see inflation going on, when there obviously is too much money in the real economy, then you've got to tax it back.
What you're saying is, instead of Bernie, who says we should absolve all student debt, And that would be a $1.6 trillion stimulus to the economy. Young people would be able to start businesses, get married, buy homes, consume in the economy. That we don't need to have a financial transaction tax. We could do this through the Fed.
Most student debt is in the form of asset-backed securities, just like the mortgage-backed securities that were on the books of the banks that were bad debts and that the Fed bought. They could buy up all these asset-backed securities that are student debt and just rip it up, or just let it sit there, don't collect on it. And nobody would be hurt. The only problem that I see with that is that you have all these people complaining that it's not fair because they say, well, I paid off my student debts, or my home is underwater. Why don't I get my loans written off, et cetera. That's why I prefer a universal basic income as like a national dividend, that we need more money in the system. We want to distribute it fairly. So let's just give it to everybody, the same amount to everyone. And then you solve a lot of problems of distribution. You don't have to apply for welfare and prove that you deserve it. Everybody gets the same. You've got some extra money out there. Let the people decide for themselves how they want to spend it. If they want to pay down their debts, great. If they want to.
I don't know. I would disagree with you on that because I think this thing about not fair, we can't get into that conversation about not fair because then you have people saying, moderates like Amy Klobuchar saying, I don't want to pay for rich people to go to college. Why should we provide that? When in fact we already provide for rich people. Rich people pay taxes to the public school system anyway, through their property tax, whether they use it or not. So they can spend their extra money to go to private colleges. So if people are paying taxes, they should be able to go to the public colleges if they want to. And if they have extra money, they can go to the private colleges and pay for that. So I remember the uprising in Wisconsin when all those union workers converged on Madison, and because Scott Walker was going to get rid of collective bargaining. And there was a private sector worker who was interviewed, and they said, why should they get these benefits? I don't get them. Instead of asking the question, why don't I get these benefits? So instead of feeling like you're being cheated or shorted, I think people, if they felt more magnanimous about their fellow American and felt more generous, we know from social psychology that giving to others makes you feel better about yourself than buying something for yourself. So I think people need to approach these kinds of programs without a sense of being shorted, but with a sense of, well-being for everybody, a collectivized kind of experience. And plus the universal basic income, because Andrew Yang talks about that, $1,000 a month is not enough to do anything. It's certainly not even enough to rent a one-bedroom apartment anywhere in these 50 states.
Since virtually all money is digital anyway, you can just have it go automatically to the banks, and anyone who has debt, it goes to pay down their debt. And so what you're doing, it's not like the idea is not to benefit the people per se for specific things. The idea is to get rid of this debt burden that's preventing the economy from working.
It really isn't a problem to have all this debt. When you have fiat currency, when you print your own money, you're not really, it's not a problem. And you can pay for everything. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure, I would agree if we actually did that. But my problem with modern monetary theory is they say that the government spends money into existence. They don't. It's illegal. What we have to do is change the Federal Reserve Act. Right now, the Federal Reserve Act says that the government is not allowed to borrow directly from the Federal Reserve, and they're not allowed to have an overdraft on their Fed account. So when they run up a debt, it is an interest-bearing debt, and the interest bill, it's estimated by 2027 that the interest alone on the federal debt will be $1 trillion a year. Well, there is absolutely, $1 trillion a year. We could fund the whole infrastructure program that President Trump promised and we never got with that $1 trillion. Why do we need to pay interest at all on our federal debt? And we wouldn't if we got it from the Fed, but we're not allowed to do it under current rules. So I'm saying you don't need to go into debt. You print the money. That's
Right.
not a debt. But modern monetary theory says we can run up the deficit. And I'm saying, no, we don't need to, and we shouldn't, because that's going to run up the interest bill, which is the deficit itself doesn't hurt. I mean, 22 trillion, nobody's ever going to pay that off. We just keep rolling it over.
Yeah.
It's the interest that hurts. We have to pay that interest every single year. And it is one of those things that must be paid. You know, you can cut back on medical or any of those things, but interest absolutely must be paid. For some reason, the finance industry rules.
Our bill is moving forward. We got it through the Assembly. It's going through the Senate. We're talking about getting public banks in the 5th largest economy in the world. You want to talk a little bit about that to close on a positive note?
AB 857, which is a bill to make it easier to set up local municipal banks, publicly owned banks. And there are 10 different cities or advocates in 10 different cities who are promoting it. They've got hundreds of groups supporting the bill. I mean, it's amazing the amount of support they've generated. And it's made it through all the way through the Assembly, and it's on its last committee in the Senate, the California Senate. And then it will go to the governor. Now, we had a bill that passed both houses of the legislature, and Governor Brown didn't sign it. But this governor Gavin Newsom has said that he supports public banking. So we're hopeful that, you know, he would sign it if it made it up to his desk. And New York has just introduced a copycat bill, which is like identical to AB 857. They'll modify it over time to suit their needs. But anyway, that'd be great. You know, if all the states, it seems to be catching on. The whole public banking movement is, we've got, I think, over 25 bills in different cities and states across the country that are actively being pursued by different groups. So.
Right. Well, it's a real counter to neoliberalism. I think we need to have public banks, public housing, public broadband, Medicare for all. We need to take important goods and services out of the private sector. I don't think housing, for instance, we should depend on real estate developers to provide affordable housing any more than we can depend on private healthcare insurers to provide affordable healthcare. So the title of your article is Neoliberalism Has Met Its Match in China. And maybe we will learn from our war with China. Maybe China will win and it'll finally humble us. We've run out of time. I want to thank you very much, Ellen, for being with me. Enjoy the rest of your time in Colombia, and we'll see you soon when you get back to LA.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. Great
All right.
talking to you.
Sunday, I'm going to be doing a show. I'm not really sure what the topic is going to be, what the guest is going to be. I'm sure I'm doing a show on Sunday, though, back at my regular time at 7 p.m. It might be my show with my friend Kim Kaufman, who can talk a lot about KPFK, our struggling public radio station here in Los Angeles, and also the other Pacifica radio stations across the country that are having trouble. And it might be another idea that I'm tossing around. But in any case, I will next be live streaming on Tuesday morning from the Board of Supervisors, where we're going to be having a rally to cancel the contract with McCarthy. This is to try to stop the $2.5 billion construction of a mental health jail. We had a victory in February where they canceled the women's prison in Lancaster that was going to be built on toxic soil, and a little bit of a victory in that they decided that we shouldn't have a mental health jail, and they changed the name, and it's a mental health treatment center. But any facility that's going to warehouse 3,500 people is a jail by any other name. And the other thing that happened in February was they had a task force on alternatives to incarceration, which released their report. And one of the things that we know we need to have, and we've known this since Reagan deinstitutionalized the mental institutions, was we need to have centers in our communities where our mentally ill people are coming from. So the idea is to try to take this money, to cancel this contract, pay this company whatever cancellation payment we owe them, and divert the remaining money into building centers, mental health centers, in each of the 5 supervisorial districts. The Board of Supervisors, which includes 4 women, 4 of the 5 members are women, And Hilda Solis and Sheila Kuehl have been really leading on this. They completely changed direction, and they're very receptive to this. So now it's a matter of convincing the other ones, and hopefully we can get this done, because as Bernie Sanders says, we need jobs and education, not jails and incarceration. And if you haven't already seen it, I have a 2-hour live stream of a protest that we did at the GEO Group headquarters in Los Angeles this past Tuesday, a group organized by Never Again Action, which is only about 5 weeks old. We've been doing a lot of actions at the ICE detention centers. In fact, they're doing one right now as we speak at Adelanto. We took over this building, the lobby of the building. There were 10 people that blocked entrances inside and several people that blocked entrances outside. And I got the exclusive live stream to go in with the police to cover the arrest, to interview the arrestees. And we're in the process of editing a shorter video on it, which I will be posting on my YouTube channel. So if you don't already follow me on Twitter, I'm at Lauren_Steiner, and I'm going to put Ellen Brown's website one more time up here. And you can go and see all of her articles that she's ever written, and also look for her writing in Truth Dig. So until I see you next, keep fighting.